Chapter 104 of the Ontario Reader, third book by the Ontario Ministry of Education. Read for LibriVox.org by Antoine Kaufmann. The 13th of October 1812 is a day ever to be remembered in Canada. All along the Niagara River the greatest excitement had prevailed. Many of the inhabitants had removed with their portable property into the back country. Small bodies of soldiers, regulars and volunteers were posted in the towns and villages. Indians were roving in the adjacent woods, and sentinels posted along the banks of the river were looking eagerly for the enemy that was to come from the American shore and attempt the subjugation of a free, a happy, and a loyal people. In the village of Queenston, that nestles at the foot of an eminence overlooking the mighty waters of Niagara, 2 companies of the 49th Regiment, or Green Tigers as the American afterwards termed them, with 100 Canadian militia, were posted under the command of Captain Dennis. When tattoo sounded on the night of the 12th, the little garrison retired to rest. All was silent but the elements which raged furiously throughout the night. Nothing was to be heard but the howling of the wind and the sound of falling rain mingled with the distant roar of the great cataract. Dripping with rain and shivering with cold, the sentries paced their weary rounds, from time to time casting a glance over to the swollen tide of the river towards the American shore. At length, when the grey dawn of morning appeared, a wary sentinel descried a number of boats, filled with armed men, pushing off from the opposite bank below the village of Lewiston. Immediately the alarm was given. The soldiers were roused from their peaceful slumbers and marched down to the landing place. Meanwhile a battery of 1 gun posted on the height and another about a mile below began to play on the enemy's boats, sinking some and disabling others. Finding it impossible to effect a landing in the face of such a position, the Americans, leaving a few of their number to occupy the attention of the troops on the bank, disembarked some distance up the river and succeeded in gaining the summit of the height by a difficult and unprotected pathway. With loud cheers they captured the 1-gun battery and rushed down upon Captain Dennis and his command, who, finding themselves far outnumbered by the enemy, retired slowly towards the north end of the village. Here they were met by General Brock, who had set out in advance of reinforcements from the town of Niagara, accompanied only by 2 officers. Placing himself at the head of the little band, the gallant general cried, "Follow me!" and, amid the cheers of regulars and militia, he led his men back to the height from which they had been forced to retire. At the foot of the hill the general dismounted, under the sharp fire of the enemy's riflemen, who were posted among the trees on its summit, climbed over a high stone wall, and waving his sword charged up to the hill at the head of his soldiers. This intrepid conduct at once attracted the notice of the enemy. One of their sharpshooters advanced a few paces, took deliberate aim, and shot the general in the breast. It was a mortal wound. Thus fell Sir Isaac Brock, the hero of Upper Canada, whose name will outlive the noble monument which a grateful country has erected to his memory. The fall of their beloved commander infuriated his followers. With loud cheers of "Revenge the General!" they pressed forward up the hill and drove the enemy from their position. But reinforcements were continually pouring in from the American shore, and after a deadly struggle in which Colonel MacDonell, Captain Dennis, and most of the other officers fell, these brave men were again compelled to retire. They took refuge under the guns of the lower battery, there awaiting the arrival of reinforcements from Niagara. About midday the first of these arrived, consisting of a band of 50 Mohawks under their chiefs Norton and Brand. These Indian allies boldly engaged the enemy and maintained for a short time a sharp skirmish, but finally retired on the main reinforcement. This arrived in the course of the afternoon under the command of Major General Chiaffi. Instead of meeting the enemy on the old ground, the officer now in command moved his whole force of 1,000 men to the right of the enemy's position and sent forward his left flank to attack the American right. This left flank was of a very varied character, consisting of one company of the 41st Regiment of the Line, a company of colored men, and a body of volunteer militia and Indians, united in spite of their difference of color and race by loyalty to the British Crown and hatred of foreign aggression. This division advanced in a gallant style. After delivering a volley, the whole line of white, red, and black charged the enemy and drove in his right wing at the point of the bayonet. General Schiaffy now led on the main body and forced the lately victorious Americans to retreat rapidly over the ridge. The struggle on their part was of short duration. In front was a foe thirsting for revenge, behind the steep banks and swiftly flowing waters of Niagara. The Green Tigers, the Indians, their most despised slaves, and last but certainly not least, the gallant Canadian militia, were objects of terror to them. Some few, in despair, threw themselves over the precipice into the river, but the majority of the survivors surrendered themselves prisoners of war to the number of 950, among whom was their commander, General Wadsworth. The leader of the expedition, General von Rensselaer, had retired to Lewiston, as he said, for reinforcement in the early part of the day. The loss of the Americans in this memorable action was about 500 killed and wounded, while that of the Canadian forces amounted to 150. Throughout Canada, the news of the victory of Queenston Heights awakened universal joy and enthusiasm, second only to that with which the taking of Detroit was hailed. But the joy and enthusiasm were damped by the sad tidings that he who had first taught Canada's sons the way to victory had given his life for her defense and slept in a soldier's grave with many of her best and bravest. End of section 104. This recording is in the public domain.